The morning I entered that courtroom, I could feel Hannah's impatience before she even said a word. She exchanged a quick glance with her husband, Victor, and rolled her eyes in a way that told the entire room what she thought of me. A tired old woman who had outstayed her welcome in her own life. But then, the unexpected happened. The judge paused in the middle of his statement, his gaze fixing directly on me. A hush spread through the courtroom, the kind that makes even the air feel heavy. Hannah's smirk faltered, and Victor's face drained of color. "Mrs. Reynolds," the judge said slowly, disbelief threading his tone, "you're really here." In that instant, the balance of power shifted. Hannah's control, Victor's arrogance, both dissolved. The truth they had buried was about to surface. My name is Anita Reynolds. I am 70 years old, and for decades I believed myself to be nothing more than an ordinary grandmother in Austin, Texas. My days unfolded like clockwork. At 5:30 every morning I boiled water and poured steaming coffee into the chipped anniversary mug Robert, my late husband, had given me on our 30th year together. It wasn't just a mug. It carried the weight of our history, his laughter, his memory. Afterward, I would slide into Robert's worn garden shoes and step into the yard. Orchids lined my windowsill, their blooms thriving under the care of my hands. I'd water them slowly as dawn spilled across the kitchen window, reminding myself that life still held small, sacred rituals worth cherishing. For nearly 50 years, my life had one unwavering focus: my daughter, Hannah. Robert and I worked ourselves weary to ensure she had opportunities we never dreamed of. During the day, I scrubbed other people's homes. At night, I bent over my sewing machine, mending clothes for spare cash. On weekends, Robert and I sold tamales and pies at the corner stall, saving every dollar to fund Hannah's education. We celebrated her smallest victories as though they were monumental. Every school certificate, every step forward, it all felt like proof that our sacrifices were worth it. When Robert passed, I thought Hannah and I would cling to one another more tightly than ever. I imagined dinners filled with shared grief, long talks and comfort. But reality was cruelly different. The warmth faded. Distance crept in. It was a Tuesday when Hannah and Victor arrived without warning. Victor swaggered into my home, plopping himself into Robert's chair, the one worn smooth from decades of loyalty and love, as though it belonged to him. He snatched up the remote, barely glancing at me. Hannah followed with a folder tucked under her arm. She placed it on the table, her voice calm, rehearsed. "Mom, this house is too much for you. We found you a nice residence, nurses, activities, people your age." My chest tightened. "This is our home, Hannah. Every memory of your childhood is in these walls, Victor." Didn't look up. "Memories aren't in walls, Mrs. Reynolds. They're just in your head." The words sliced through me like a knife. And in that moment, I finally understood. Their concern wasn't love. It was greed. From that day forward, the pressure on me only grew heavier. Realtors I had never spoken to began appearing at my door, clipboards in hand, strolling through my living room as if I were already gone. They measured spaces, muttered about renovations, and discussed resale potential, while I stood silently in the corner, an invisible guest in my own home. Boxes appeared in the hallway, each neatly labeled in Hannah's handwriting: donate, storage, trash. My life, my memories, my identity, sorted into categories without my consent. I watched Hannah pick up the navy blue dress I had worn to Robert's funeral. Without hesitation, she tossed it into the donate pile. That dress had held my grief, my love, my final goodbye, and she discarded it as though it were meaningless fabric. Then came the moment that broke something inside me. Hannah reached for the small wooden jewelry box Robert had given me on our first anniversary. Inside was a pearl necklace from my mother, a family heirloom I treasured. Hannah slid the box into her handbag with a soft, dismissive tone. "This will be safer with me." But I knew. Safety had nothing to do with it. The gleam in her eyes wasn't protection. It was possession. That night, the silence in the house pressed down on me like a suffocating weight. I sat alone in my bedroom, tears slipping quietly down my cheeks. I grieved not just the invasion of my home, but the daughter I thought I knew. For a moment, it felt as though I had already been buried under their plans, discarded, irrelevant, forgotten. Then something inside me shifted. I caught my own reflection in the mirror. My face was tired, my heart heavy, but my eyes still carried a spark. I whispered to myself, firm despite the tremor in my voice, "I will not go quietly. If they want to fight, they will find me ready." The very next morning, Hannah insisted on cleaning out Robert's office. That room had been untouched since he passed, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. While she stepped outside to bring in more boxes, I quietly locked the door behind me. I scanned the bookshelves Robert had always kept so carefully. That was when I noticed something unusual, a small square panel hidden behind a row of encyclopedias. My hands shook as I pulled the books aside, revealing a built-in safe. I tried every number that made sense, our wedding date, Robert's birthday, Hannah's birthday. Nothing worked. My chest tightened with frustration until one memory surfaced. A rainy afternoon decades ago when Robert and I had first met beneath the striped awning of a bakery. With trembling fingers, I entered that date. The lock clicked open. Inside rested a leather portfolio embossed with Robert's initials. My breath caught as I opened. Deeds to properties I had never heard of. Bank statements from accounts I didn't know existed. Stock certificates in companies Robert had quietly invested in. And in the center, a sealed envelope with my name written in his familiar hand. "My dearest Anita," it began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. These assets are yours alone. Hannah will only inherit if she treats you with love and respect. Do not doubt your strength." Among the papers was a deed to the condominium Hannah and Victor proudly called theirs, proof that it was mine all along. Behind it, shares of Victor's company, enough to sway its decisions. Robert's foresight had stripped them of the very power they thought they held. 3 days later, I sat across from Dr. Lauren Pierce, a respected attorney known throughout Austin for her precision and fairness. Her office was orderly, sunlight pouring across stacks of neatly organized case files. When she shook my hand, her grip was steady, firm enough to calm my trembling nerves. I slid Robert's portfolio across her desk. She read every page carefully, her eyes narrowing only when she needed to, her pen tapping lightly against the paper as if weighing each detail. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said with quiet certainty, "your husband was meticulous. Everything here is airtight. The deeds are valid, the accounts properly registered, and his letter of intent leaves no room for dispute. Your daughter and her husband cannot touch what is rightfully yours." Her words steadied me like an anchor in a storm. She gave me her advice in clear, measured steps. Sign nothing they put before you. Don't argue with them directly. Let them show who they really are. Meanwhile, we will build your defense. Anita, you are not powerless. You are the owner, and we will prove it. From that moment on, I followed her counsel with precision. I bought a small voice recorder and carried it in my pocket. Every conversation with Hannah and Victor was quietly documented. Their sharp remarks, once enough to cut me, now became evidence. I photographed every box stacked in the hallway, each one labeled in Hannah's neat script: donate, sell, trash. I wrote down every date when strangers walked through my living room as if it already belonged to them. I was no longer their victim. I was preparing for battle. One afternoon, Victor arrived with a man in a pressed white coat. "This is my friend," he announced casually, "a doctor who'll evaluate if you can still live on your own." The so-called exam lasted less than 5 minutes. The man hardly looked at me before muttering about early dementia. My pulse raced, but I kept my face calm. With a quiet click, I switched on the recorder in my lap. That recording, like every document and photograph, went into the growing folder Dr. Pierce would one day carry into court. A week later, Hannah and Victor drove me across town to tour a senior residence they had chosen. The moment I walked inside, dread pooled in my stomach. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with something sour beneath it. The rooms were narrow, barely big enough for a bed and dresser. Elderly residents slumped in wheelchairs along the halls, their eyes vacant. "Look, Mom," Hannah said brightly, "they even have a TV room." I glanced inside. A handful of residents sat staring blankly at a flickering screen. My chest tightened. "How much does this cost?" I asked. Victor's answer was cold, dismissive. "Don't worry. We'll sell your house." The silence that followed said everything they wouldn't. My home was never about safety, it was about money, and in that moment I vowed they would never succeed. 2 days later, Hannah and Victor returned, their arms full of paperwork. They spread the documents across my kitchen table with a false sense of authority. "Mom," Hannah said, her tone rehearsed, "just sign here and everything will be settled." Beside her stood a man in a suit she introduced as their attorney. His shifting eyes and nervous hands told me he wasn't nearly as confident as they wanted him to appear. I pretended to study the pages when the doorbell rang. Victor groaned, clearly annoyed. Expecting a neighbor, I opened the door and froze. There stood Dr. Pierce, her briefcase in hand, flanked by a process server and a representative from Adult Protective Services. "Good afternoon," Dr. Pierce said firmly. "We're here regarding allegations of elder abuse and attempted fraud." The man in the suit paled instantly. Hannah's pen hovered in midair. Victor's jaw tightened. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the recorder, setting it on the table. "For weeks," I said evenly, "you've pressured me. You've called me weak, forgetful, incapable. Yet here is Victor, admitting the stove story was fabricated." The APS worker moved through the hallway, inspecting the boxes stacked against the walls, labeled neatly in Hannah's script. Donate, trash, sell. Evidence of their plan was everywhere. Then I placed Robert's portfolio on the table. The deeds, the accounts, the shares in Victor's company, their faces drained of color. For the first time, silence worked in my favor. The following week, Victor contacted Dr. Pierce through back channels. His arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. He wanted to negotiate. Their offer was simple. They would leave me alone if I allowed them to remain in their condominium for 6 months. I considered it. Then I answered calmly, "They may stay, but the rent goes up by 50%, effective immediately." Victor had no choice but to agree. The man who once sat smugly in Robert's chair now paid me for the roof over his head. 2 weeks later, there was a knock on my door. Hannah stood outside alone, clutching 2 cardboard boxes. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders slumped. "May I come in?" she whispered. She placed the boxes on the table. Inside were my jewelry, photo albums, and the bundle of letters Robert had written me decades ago. "These belong to you," she said, her voice breaking. "I should never have taken them." Victor convinced me. You were slipping, that you couldn't manage. It was easier to believe him than face the truth about the man I married. I didn't rush to forgive her. I let her words hang in the air. Finally, I said, "You broke something deep, Hannah. But broken things can be mended if we're willing to work at it." Her tears fell freely as she nodded. Months later, the Robert Reynolds Foundation was born, a nonprofit to protect elders from financial exploitation and abandonment. Hannah worked beside me, rebuilding her life one day at a time. But when Victor resurfaced under an alias, preying on other widows, I knew my fight wasn't over. In a packed courtroom, I took the stand against him, and when the gavel fell, sentencing him to 12 years in prison, I realized something profound. I hadn't just reclaimed my dignity. I had turned my pain into a shield for countless others.